Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Bryan. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Welcome to the Great Man Within podcast. Every episode is designed to help you discover and live the great man within you. This is the third episode in a row that we are dedicating to the topic of race. The first two episodes I recorded solo, and those were titled Anti-Racism for the White Man Ready to Step Off the Sidelines. And that was recorded with the intent of, for the white men listeners of this audience who are ready to step up and go from being silent in their anti-racism to actively anti-racist, but not knowing how to do so, that's the episode for you. The episode most recently released was called Afraid to Stay Silent, but Terrified to Speak Up. And I recorded that in response to many of the men and women. It's the number one question I was getting from men and women in the white community of, I know it's time to speak out. I want to speak out. I know it's the right thing to speak out. I believe in speaking out, but I'm terrified to say the wrong thing, to trip over myself, to hit a landmine, and then to be criticized as a result, or to have my character assassinated as a result. And so that episode was dedicated to helping walk you through the steps of unraveling that fear, finding the courage, and ways that you can speak out in a way that feels powerful and a part of the cause, so that you no longer stay silent and complicit in allowing inequality or injustice to continue. And I'm really excited to have Bryan back on the show so we can have a really important dialogue around how to build racial stamina. Now, racial stamina is a term that I learned from Robin DiAngelo, who's a 25-year practitioner of teaching anti-racism. She wrote the New York Times bestselling book, White Fragility. And she defines racial stamina as the ability to talk openly, constructively, and civilly about race. Now, the date of today's recording is Friday, June 5th. And I've definitely started to notice that large portions of the white community are already feeling exhausted, tired, fatigued of the racial conversations that are nonstop, omnipresent in today's era. Now, chances are, if race isn't a conscious part of your existence until times like the present, then an ongoing dialogue about race may feel tiresome, exhausting, and heavy. That's because meaningful conversations about race require lots of time, lots of energy, lots of emotions. And if we're going to do it well, lots of patience. And pretty much all the things that I just mentioned are in short supply: time, energy, and patience. And so for the white community who have never had conversations like these over an extended period of time in such an emotional way and an energetically draining way, our tank can be on E quite quickly. But that is not a reason to turn the channel, not by a long shot. I certainly know what it feels like to be tired of these kinds of conversations. For most of my 4 decades on this planet, I felt that way. When things and times and periods that would have a particular focus on race would pop up, that I would wait for it to go back to, quote, normal, because I had the privilege of being able to live an existence where race wasn't a conscious part of my day in and day out. But for most, if not all people of color, at least from what I've learned from listening to their stories and reading the books and having dialogues with people who I care about and who care about me, is that race is a daily waking part of their conscious existence, whether it's not going outside because you're Black late at night in a white suburban community and worrying about if you're going to be pulled over or hunted down, whether it's going into a convenience store and wondering if someone's going to be looking at you, worrying if you're stealing something, or worrying about going for a top flight job in a financial services organization where 100% of the executive decision-making committee is white and you're the only non-white candidate. These are things that people of color, and specifically in this movement, we're talking about Black people, deal with on a daily basis. Racial stamina, the ability to talk openly, constructively, and civilly about race, is a daily practice in their lives. And so there's not a lot of compassion when they see white people, myself included, becoming fatigued in a 2-week period of time where we want to change the channel. And so that's why today, Bryan and I are talking about the importance of building racial stamina and the reasons why we don't have it to begin with. So in today's episode, you're going to hear us define what white privilege is, why the term white privilege is not an attack on whiteness or you personally, why you don't need to feel guilty or shameful for having white privilege, but how you can use white privilege to do significant good if you do the work to understand it. And you'll have a chance to hear from Bryan candidly sharing about how in just the last week and a half alone, he went from being someone who was on the sidelines, thinking he was doing the right thing just by believing that he was not racist, to recognizing that wasn't nearly enough, and how he's now actively identified himself publicly as anti-racist, is doing the inner work, is educating himself, and is starting to pass this along to others. And finally, as in every episode that we release on race, it is our intention that one day you will bypass us and go direct to the sources, the experts who have dedicated their lives to either battling racism, helping to dismantle racism through legislation or leading movements, to anti-racism teachers. And with each episode, we're going to link in the show notes the resource guides that you can go and find the experts that speak to you. And in the meantime, Bryan and I wish to serve as your bridges to the Black leaders, to the people of color, to the anti-racist teachers whose messages may have eluded you until now. And so for the time being, we will be your bridge, but please listen to this with the intention of bypassing us in the future and going straight to the source. Enjoy today's episode of How to Build Racial Stamina. Bryan, dude, these conversations around race are so difficult that we feel like we are starting over the podcast from the very beginning, like when we used to start to record and then have to delete, start, stop. Like we just don't know how to talk about this stuff as fluently as we do with some of these other topics on the podcast. This is literally like our 5th time stopping and starting because these issues are so challenging. And over these last few, I'm so excited to get you on the show now and have your voice as a part of this narrative, because the last few days have been my own solo recordings. And over this last week, you and I have had a lot of offline conversations around what's happening in our country, what's happening in our own local communities, what's happening with our friends, what's inside of our men's group, right? With a Black man that's inside of our men's group and having a chance to witness his pain. So you've had a chance to listen to the solo episodes that I released earlier this week around anti-racism for white men who are ready to step off the sideline, and the episode I released this morning, which was called Afraid to Stay Silent, but Terrified to Speak Up for Fear of Criticism. What do I do? And we had a conversation with the Great Man Mastermind last night, where we brought on Giovanni Beckford, who's a friend of the show. He's been a guest on the show before. He's an African-American man who came to have a deep discussion with us about how he sees what's going on in the world and how influential white men can be a part of the solution. And he did an hour-long amazing conversation with us last night. So with all of that as the backdrop, man, what has Bryan Stacy been experiencing over this last week? And what can you share with our audience who wants to hear from you?
Dude, I definitely resonate with the anxiousness. We've hit stop and re-record here a bunch of different times because sometimes finding the words even to answer that question, Dominic, is difficult. And I come to you here in a state of evolution, of growth. It wasn't that long ago. It was 8 freaking days ago that I feel like I just started to wake up to this stuff. The conversation that you and I had about this topic of racism in America, I still wasn't ready for it 8 days ago. And as a matter of fact, the conversation I had with you, I was like, look, I understand this is important, but there's other people out there doing this sort of thing. And I have a lot of attention on other areas in life that need attention. And so this isn't really a Bryan thing. And there was almost an anger involved with that. Like this is something I have to deal with is this a distraction? And I feel awful. I feel shameful about even having that feeling just 8 days ago. So I'm feeling overwhelmed, man. And I'm appreciative of the Black people in my lives that have been willing to have a conversation with me about this topic. One of the guys in our men's group in particular has been the biggest catalyst in my awareness around the size of this issue. how I've been part of it unknowingly. Like you meant your podcast was how to get off the sidelines. I didn't know I was on the
Mm.
sidelines. If you would have asked me 8 days ago, I would have said, I'm doing everything. I'm doing enough in this area around racism because I'm not racist.
Yeah.
Racists are really bad
To that
people.
point, Bryan, was that kind of like your definition of I'm doing my part by not being racist? Is that like what allowed you to say, okay, like I've participated enough to feel part of the solution?
Yes, I feel I was even doing my part, Dominic, by not addressing the fact that people were different colors than
Right.
me.
Like the I don't see race, like the I don't see race kind of thing.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, like, hey, like we're kind of past that, right? So like let's just pretend that it's not. And I still am speaking, a full 8 days later, like with a lot of ignorance here. But I want to say a big thank you to those people in my life, including the man in our men's group, because they have taken the time and I didn't realize because all I've seen is the outcome. And the guy in our men's group is like a rock star of a human being, successful by all measures. And all I have seen is that version of him. And I didn't understand or know his stories, nor have I cared to even ask before this what it was like for him to grow up in America as a black man. That is what has at least woken me up to be curious enough to continue this conversation.
We have actually permission to use his name. I reached out to him. So we're talking about our good friend, Andrew Pop, who is a part of our men's group on Monday nights. We meet together, for 2 hours every Monday night, Zoom virtually. And what you're bringing up, Bryan, I think is so powerful because when you have someone in your life that you love, like that is in so much pain and can reveal that pain, and he did so, in our men's group this past Monday night at such a detailed level where he started to share, like going back to childhood where he grew up in mostly a white community where he was always the other, right? The outsider, the outlier. And one of the things I've learned from reading about anti-racist literature is, as white people, we see all different races, but the ultimate other race is black. Like for white people, the ultimate other race, meaning, yes, there are Asians, yes, there are Indians, yes, there are Hispanics, but the ultimate other, the ultimate most different from us are black. And there's a whole series of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that come with that. So Andrew grew up, his father is white as can be, as he describes it. His mother is black. And so he's not 100% black, but because he looks black, he gets treated as black. It's an optics. Like if you look black, you're black. And growing up, he said that when he was like driving around in a car with his white friends and a cop would come to the car, like he would get treated differently, right? Like he would be looked at more suspiciously. When he went to campus in college to play soccer, he was one of two black kids on campus. And he always felt like on the outside looking in. And like race for him wasn't a flare up every once in a while like it is for white people. Like, we don't really have to address race all that often until things like this start to happen. Like we can truly bury our heads in the sand and race not be an issue. But he lives it on a daily basis. Every single day he is reminded of his race. And he gave us the gift of opening up his heart and soul during the meeting on Monday night that let us see his lifetime of pain. And I think that like, what you're saying here is, and I definitely have seen a shift in you since Monday night, that cracked you open. Like that made it realer for you than anything else that we've seen on the news that may be like travesties against other human beings, but there was still some kind of like, like distancing between that and this really close to home experience that you had with Andrew.
Yeah, that's right, man. And what's been on the news with George Floyd and all these other Cooper and all these stories that are happening right now, like yes, that's in my face, but there's been other things. I mean, going all the way back to 2013 and way beyond that I've dismissed. I've just said like that's a thing, that's a one-off, that's a and to see how universal this is and how it affects everybody, all black people, has really illuminated that I need to do some more education on this.
We all do. We all do. And I just think about how thankful and grateful I am that Andrew is in our group, right? That like he was able to give us that experience, that lens into a world that none of us have walked before. I mean, from the outside, yes, we've read things, we've seen things, but never like that closely. And I think one of the questions that a lot of the white community brings to me, brings to us, around, well, okay, I know I need to make a difference. I know I need to do something differently, but I'm having a hard time figuring out like how to make a practical application of that in my life. And I think this is actually going to be a really good opportunity for us to talk about the formation of our men's group and how we've evolved over time. Our men's group, which we've been a part of for over 2 years now, when we first started it, it was really around this idea of like, how can we come together as men and learn how to develop emotional fluency? Emotional fluency, which is basically the ability to feel a feeling, to name the feeling, to be with that feeling, to express that feeling, and then to transmute that feeling, to shift that feeling if desired, right? That's something that like is a super skill a lot of men, including myself, didn't have years ago, right? Until doing this work.
Even when I hear this 2 years later, that sounds really
And it sounds hard because it's difficult.
But I bet you can't say feelings one more time.
I've already said it enough. Okay. But when we first started that, it was just kind of like there was this excitement of, hey, who's a guy that I know that's closest in my life? And then boom, we formed this group. And all of a sudden, we had 8 white guys from Brooklyn, 7 white guys from Brooklyn, and I was the one guy from Manhattan. And we didn't even think about it. Like diversity wasn't even a question about like how we're going to construct this group. It was just, it seemed like benevolent ignorance, just not even making that a part of the construction process. It was just like, oh, who's a guy that I love? And we brought you in and other guys in. And now here we are, a group of men who are now really working on themselves, influential, powerful, who have audiences of people who listen to us. And yet we are without any other person of color in our group, right? To share that experience with us. And last year, we started to take a look at that and say, whoa, like maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we could have done this differently. And if we are continuing to grow our group, what do we want the future of our group to look like? And I know we had some really challenging conversations as a group, Bryan, right? Where how do you bring in people of color when you're already whitewashed? Like, are they going to want to join our group? And how many people do we have join our group? We already feel like we're kind of like at our capacity. And if we bring in just one person, is that the tokenism problem? If we bring in 2 people, it's like, so we had to go through all of those really challenging conversations, and some stuff came up that was uncomfortable, man. And I'm just curious about how you remember those conversations, and then we can lead the conversation to what the decisions that we ended up making.
I remember one specific conversation, which was, okay, who are the Black people in our lives or people of color in our lives that we can reach out to? And how do we have this conversation with them? Do we tell them? Do we say, hey, we are looking to be proactively more diverse and you may be the only one that's not white? Or do we just put that under the cover? Like, don't talk about that and just bring them in because they're an awesome human being. And that's it. Because we don't want to address that color thing. And as a group, we decided to have the conversation about we are actively trying to be diverse.
Yeah.
It was a point of, how do we do this? How do we even have the conversation?
Yeah, and you know what I'm remembering as well here is one of the points of contention was we were already at 8, and there was another man who was like one of our closest friends, a white man who like absolutely from all intents belonged in the group. Like one of the things that we say is admission for the group is this criteria of, does this man call you forward? Right? Like, does he make you feel inspired? Does he call you forward to a higher standard? And there was another white man who was like ready, wanted to be a part of a group. And we were like, how do we keep him out? But then also like, how do we let him in if like we have this commitment to diversity? And it led to some really heated conversations, right? And it was really challenging and difficult. I remember being like one of the biggest proponents of diversity. And also I'm super tight with this guy who like, wants to be let in. And we had to go through all of the uncomfortable, time-consuming conversations. And what's a beautiful thing about this, Bryan, is the way that things work out. One of the men in our men's group ended up leaving. It opened up an additional spot. The white man that we're talking about, we wanted to bring in, was brought in. And we also decided to move forward. And we made these invitations and are continuing to make the invitations to people of color. And in this case, Andrew, where we were very upfront and said like, hey, listen, we've had some realization that we built this group without a big enough vision. And we've come to realize that like we want diversity to be a part of our ongoing work together. And we recognize as we're coming to you, this may not be an ideal situation for you, like who may want a men's group, but to be the one person that doesn't look like anyone else right now. But we still couldn't, because of that discomfort, we didn't want to make the choice for you. And Mark brought the conversation to Andrew, and Andrew chose to join our group. And thank God he did, because he's bringing that perspective that we never would have had.
Thank God we did, because we can have that conversation now. And one of the things that came up when Andrew was talking, and this was true of Giovanni in the conversation even just last night, is I didn't understand, like, why haven't I heard of this before? Not that I haven't heard of racism, of course, and not that I haven't seen the news, but from you specifically, Andrew, or from you, Giovanni, specifically, I haven't heard you ever talk about the feelings that you are now talking about. And what they both echoed was so powerful. And again, if we had a group of all white guys, I couldn't even ask the question. And so when we talk about the importance of diversity, like, this is it, right? Case in
That's
point.
right.
So what they both said was, Bryan, we've been dealing with this so long that we've normalized it.
Yeah.
And we went through a period in our lives where we were angry and where we were trying to fight back and realized it wasn't going anywhere. That was really frustrating. So of course we don't talk about this all the time. And when all of these things in the news, as we're all sitting at home, captivated, looking at this, it has triggered a latent PTSD like experience. It has triggered this. So, like, you want to know why I'm angry now? Because this is bullshit, and it's continuing to happen. It's continued to happen my entire life and for generations before me. And when I started to feel that from them, I said, holy shit, this is a different ballgame than I thought we were playing.
Yeah, man. There's a specific medical term for this, right? There's PTSD that comes from maybe an acute situation like wartime, like being raped or being violently attacked. So moment in time. But there's also something called CPTSD, complex PTSD, which is a series of experiences over a longer period of time that could kind of like the slow shock that you spoke about. Remember at the very beginning of the coronavirus, it was kind of like there's some people experiencing PTSD. Maybe these are frontline healthcare workers, paramedics who see this stuff up front, someone who's lost a loved one or lost a business. That's acute PTSD. But that slow shock of, when we were first told to kind of come into our homes, and then now we're staying in our homes for not just weeks, but now months. It's like we're going in that warm water, and then it's turned up to a boil, and now we're like boiling.
Right.
That's what Andrew has described. That's what Giovanni's described. And I remember him last night saying, like, he hasn't watched intentionally any of the videos of George Floyd or others or Ahmaud Arbery, because he's like, if I were to watch that, it would trigger my PTSD into a place where I'd be destabilized. Right. And so this stuff runs really, really deep.
Yeah. Last night during the mastermind, you had one of the guys, Mark, lead us through a visualization. And he told us before going into the visualization, the purpose of it was to feel into whatever emotions are popping up and to stay with it, to stay with that feeling. And the point was to be okay with that uncomfortability. And one of the things he asked us while we were in the visualization was to picture inequality
and suffering,
to picture a scenario and suffering, inequality and suffering, inequality and suffering. And Dominic, what I saw was a profile of two different giant groups of people. And on the left-hand side, we had people that were going about their lives, doing their things, generally happy, like just life, like life as Bryan has seen life so far. On the other side was inequality, of having to try so hard, of screaming, of asking. And in between these two groups was a one-sided mirror. And on the, let's call it the Bryan side, let's call it the white side, like when I looked over there, I could hear the thumping, I could hear some of the noises, but it was really easy to dismiss. It was really easy to say, I don't know what that is. Like, it's probably something, but I'm not really going to worry about it.
Because you couldn't see them, right? Like, you couldn't see them. All you could see was the mirror looking back at you, right? Yeah.
Yes, that's all I could see. It was like, well, the whatever experience is going on over there must be similar to what's going on over here. So why should I pay any attention to it? But they, like, on the other side, it was a one-sided mirror. They could see what was going on and be like, this is not okay. Yeah. I feel like that has been, I mean, it's no accident that was the visualization that came to me, because I feel like that's the space that I've been in, like just blind on a sideline that I didn't know existed. And only because guys like Andrew and Giovanni have woken me up to what's really going on the other side of that mirror.
What you've described in that visual that you had is white privilege, right? Like this concept of white privilege that I want to dive into a little bit here, because to It's not a conversation that I think a lot of people have really had at a deep level, right? Like we've heard the terms, most of us hopefully by now have heard the term white privilege, but I think for many white people, it feels like an attack. It feels like a referendum on your character. So we've made assumptions around what white privilege is instead of really truly getting to understand what it is, like, and really unpacking it. And I'm going to play an audio clip here in a few moments from Talia Thomas, who is a friend of mine, who is an African-American woman and grew up here in the United States in Boulder, Colorado, and is a dear friend of mine. I played an audio clip of hers in the episode around afraid to stay silent, terrified to speak up. But let me share with you a little bit of the history around white privilege. And I'm taking this from a book called Me and White Supremacy: How to Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor, written by Layla F. Saad. And this is one of the books that I've recommended on the last podcast. One of the two books, White Fragility and Me and White Supremacy, because Me and White Supremacy is actually like a workbook. You can actually do the inner work. They give you journal prompts over a 28-day period. Awesome book. So I'm reading you a passage from that around what white privilege is. Now, Peggy McIntosh was the woman who coined the term white privilege back in 1988. And what she did was she wrote a white paper called White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And the white paper contains 50 examples of white privilege. And this is what she writes. Quote, I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. Okay. And I'm going to pause it there because the oblivious thing is what you just described in, I'm living on this side of the mirror. Life seems to be pretty good. I hear some thumping on the other side, but like, I don't know what it is and it's not really affecting me. So I can continue on doing what I'm doing. Going back to Peggy McIntosh, quote, white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, assurances, tools, maps, guides, code books, passports, visas, clothes, compass, emergency gear, and blank checks. And that's end quote. That's in her knapsack just by being white. And I think this would be a really good opportunity for you to share Giovanni's story about last night, where I know that you kind of looked at him and you were like, dude, I see this outcome of a tremendously successful 28-year-old man who's a software engineer at Google, whose mind is as sharp as a tack. And he had a response for you about what it took for him to get there.
Yeah, he said, Bryan, he said that this is where I'm at and you see this product, but I feel like I've been operating with 5x gravity.
5x gravity.
And when he explained what 5x gravity meant, he said, you have to understand the sacrifices that I have made as part of this life. He said, when I went to school, I put relationships on hold. I didn't go to any kind of spring break parties. I've never had a drop of alcohol in my life because I had to work 5 times harder to get the exact same results that some of my white colleagues and white classmates got. And those are just some really simple, straightforward examples that he gave. And it's even so easy to be like, well, okay, like you're a hard worker, you're this, you're that. But there's other examples out there, Dominic, that we could go to that weren't Giovanni related necessarily. But, I work in the HR space. And factually speaking, if you take 2 resumes, put them right next to each other, right, and one has what looks as perceived as a black name versus a white name, they can say the exact same thing, 30% less likely for the black person to get a job.
A person with a black name to get it.
With a black name, right? And that's just facts. So when we talk about like 5x gravity, that's the kind of stuff that we're referring to. And he illuminated a lot of that.
Yeah, I get it, man. And I think about, I've referenced this, I think on previous podcasts, when I was in the corporate space in financial services, the particular industry I was in, which was the retirement services industry, was very whitewashed. And whenever I looked up at the positions that, I wanted to get promoted into, the people who were making the decisions on who got that job, 80 to 90% of them were white people, and about 70% of them were white men. So I just look at like, there's like that familiarity, right? Like that I look like the person who is hiring. And so I never had to worry about that. It just never crossed my mind that I would not get a job based on race. One of the things that I almost wanted to do last night in our mastermind was a meditation where, just picture you've been asked to give a presentation on whatever it is that like is your area of expertise. And I'm asking Bryan to think about this right now, maybe like, where you've built your business around. I'm also asking you, our listener, like think about the thing that you want to speak about, whether it's like a sales presentation or anything that's close to your heart. And now you've been invited to give a talk at a round table of 25 people. And I'm speaking to our white men listeners right now, okay? You've been asked to speak in a group of 25 people. And when the door opens, the 25 people come and sit down around the table, and all 25 of those people are black. And you're the one white person. And now you are speaking to 25 black people. Have you ever found yourself in that position? Most people have not. Can you feel whatever feelings are coming up inside of you right now as you're even anticipating that? Like, do you feel confident that you'd be able to meet and match and build rapport with those 25 people in the room? Or is it such an unfamiliar feeling? Is it such a scary feeling that like your brain would be scrambled or, you would be not on top of your game? Many black people, not every black person, but many black people live that ratio every single day. That's what Giovanni's talking about when you're talking about 5x gravity, wearing like a 100-pound weighted vest, walking around all day long, trying to compete in a sprint when everyone else doesn't have that 100-pound weight on them. And then they look at you and they're kind of like, I don't see weighted vests. It's like, I don't see weighted vests. No, we're all equal, and that's just like, come on. That these are examples of white privilege in action.
Yeah, when Giovanni told me this story about him being taught at a very young age by his parents, by his mom, of how to walk into a store so you're not immediately accused of stealing something, what to do if a police officer ever approaches them. Do you know Michael Che from Saturday Night Live?
Yeah.
I heard him do an interview the other day. Now he's a comedian. He's got two brothers that are in the police force. One is a detective, one is a police officer. He said that he has never dialed 911 in his life. And I thought he never dialed 911 in his life because he had brothers that were police officers. So he would, of course, just call his family, right? That's not what he was talking about. He's never called 911 because he said, quote, I don't feel like they are for me.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I'm not even going to bring them in because I don't believe they are for me. Now, I believe, Dominic, that people do their best work when they feel safe. And you can extrapolate that to like people live their best life when they feel safe.
Right.
And so our black brothers have been living in this stew of unsafety, of some level of constant fear. Mark Manson talks about this in The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. I think he talks about this low level anxiousness that most of us feel.
Yep.
That's true. We talked a lot about that on this podcast. What I didn't understand is that black men have not a low level, but some variation from low to very high level of fear, physical fear in their life all the time.
All the time. Giovanni talked about this last night. He's like, I live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And now that there's looting and rioting, he's like, I don't go outside. I cannot go outside. Williamsburg is a primarily white, affluent neighborhood. And if he were to go outside, his life would be at risk. Like it truly would. And I can walk outside. I don't feel like my life is at risk. When the lights go down and it's dark and I want to put a hoodie on and I want to go running, I don't ever think about my life being at risk. Black men do. I was talking with a friend of mine yesterday. He's an African-American man. I don't have his permission to share this information, so I'm just going to give him a different name. We'll call him Rick because Rick is always the name we give.
That's what we always use. That's our pseudonym. Our go-to pseudonym is Rick.
Rick is a huge dude. He's 6'4". He's jacked. He's a big dude. And yet you wouldn't know it because like he kind of wears, not form-fitting clothing. He makes sure to kind of mute and like he kind of shrinks his size and his energy. And I don't know if that's because that's just who he is or if it's because it's a safety mechanism. Because if a 6'4" black man who's about 235 pounds of ripped, shredded muscle makes himself visible, he immediately decreases his life expectancy. He immediately increases like his, like whether it's being pulled over, being in the wrong place in the wrong time. So the reason why we're sharing all this stuff about like white privilege is not to shame you. We're not trying to say you feel guilty about it. You can feel that. Like I've felt guilt. I have felt shame. Our intention for bringing this up here is not to make you feel shitty or shameful. It's to wake you up to the idea that we have white privilege, that we don't have to run around with that weighted vest on, that we don't have to think about race, that we hold, when I say we, I mean many white men hold the positions of authority at all of the top levels of government, of law, of business, of media. And if anything's going to change, then we have to be a part of the solution. So I want to play a clip for you now from Talia Thomas, who talks about how white privilege is a superpower once we understand that we have it. And for those of us who want to step off the sideline, to use it as a superpower, as a tool for change to occur. So listen to these wise words from Talia Thomas.
There is white privilege, and it's a power. It is a beautiful superpower. Having white privilege is a tool and can be used for such a force of good. And that may sound woo-woo or cheesy, but what can you do with your white privilege? What can you do with your white power? And what can you inspire these other men who have this tremendous power that can really help to steer where this is going? And tremendous white men with a lot of money, because money talks, right? And especially in these types of situations, you get a lot of freaking rich white men, using their white privilege to protect and to fight against what is happening and to no longer turn a blind eye. That's pretty cool. And to support Black leaders, to give these Black leaders a platform to share what they are sharing, to say, hey, here's some information. Check out this guy. Follow this guy. I support this person. This is where I'm putting my money. And get behind these Black leaders who really, a lot of these really incredible Black leaders are only being heard by the Black community. Because you still have that segregation. You still have Black with Black, white with white. So to help help them cross the bridge into this white world by supporting what they're putting out, by listening, by putting them on your platform, by helping them to be on other platforms and sitting back and listening, doing exactly what you are doing, which is why this is so incredible. Asking how, listening, and then what else can I do? Listening, and then let me help you. Show me how. And then listen again.
Wow. That is a powerful ideology to come from. It also feels very constructive.
Mm-hmm.
I feel as though when I used to hear the word white privilege, that it was something to be ashamed of. And I also felt anger because, why should I be ashamed of something that I was born into?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't change this even if I wanted to. And I can do something with that.
Yeah.
I can use that. And that makes me feel curious about how I can start to use that as a bridge.
Yeah.
And Dominic, I am curious, something you talked about in your last podcast is this idea of performance allyship.
Right.
And it's this idea of being the person out there that's being so woke, that's talking about this stuff, that's using the white privilege to get ahead, like further ahead. And I'm curious, how do we balance this? How do we balance between this, like this superpower of white privilege and using this for equality and for justice versus what is it, like
performative allyship? Yeah.
Performative allyship. Yeah.
Yeah. Performative allyship is really kind of like making yourself the center of the story versus the movement versus like the change, right? And I'm performing like I'm an ally. It's like I'm acting really. Like at my essence, I'm not really an ally. Primarily, I'm here to manage how other people look at me, to make sure that people don't think that like I'm on the sideline. So I'll do just enough. Maybe I'll hashtag Black Lives Matter here and there. I see businesses who come out and say, hey, we stand with our Black brothers and sisters and Black Lives Matter and we're anti-racist. But then as soon as someone calls them on the mat and says, okay, well, then let me see like your executive org chart. Do you have a single person of color on your executive team? Are there any diversity councils in your organization that hold any weight? Those kinds of things. And when those businesses can't show up because the proof is not in the pudding, then that's performative allyship. It's branding, it's PR departments. And we can look at that for ourselves too. Like we do our own little branding and PR. We put up the black square on Blackout Tuesday, but that's it. We don't really do anything else about that. We don't actually dive deep into the work. So authentic allyship is really about, no, I'm here to play an essential role. And I think the bigger question that you're getting at, Bryan, is, Talia talked about how there's this superpower. And I know that you've said, when I think of superpower, I think of heroes. And then when I think of heroes are the ones who are at the center of the story.
Yes.
And you brought up earlier, like before we were recording, you heard me mention this Instagram account called No White Saviors, right? Which is talking about how, They say that white people should be a part of the solution, but we're not the lead. We're not the stars of the show. We are the supporting cast. And if you read the book King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, they talk about the hero archetype as being the immature masculine, right? The immature masculine is the hero. The mature masculine is the warrior. So the immature masculine as hero is egocentric. And the example they give is Tom Cruise, Maverick in Top Gun. Like Tom Cruise is just like this free-wielding Maverick, careless. Like he's all about ego. It's all about him. And spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Top Gun by now, like I don't mind spoiling the show for you, but Tom Cruise gets his best friend Goose killed because of his antics.
You've spoiled that movie at least 3 times on this podcast.
I think I have. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah. So, and I feel no shame about that. But the warrior archetype, the mature masculine, the warrior energy comes from being committed to a cause bigger than yourself. The warrior does what he does because he knows at the deepest core of his being that's truth. And he doesn't need adulation. He doesn't need praise. He doesn't need to be put on a stage. So many of the warrior's acts are never even noticed by humanity, not recognized consciously, but are felt. And so what we are talking about here when Talea says, you have other white people who listen to you, you have positions of authority and power, make some moves, give other Black leaders who have only been talking to other Black people, build the bridge so that they can be heard by white communities. So more people can go like what you did over this last week alone, Bryan, going from, yes, I care, but maybe not enough to actually like get into the arena to holy shit, how can I not?
Yeah, man. And this may be something that we have to cut down. I don't know how this is going to come out, but there was an anger in me that said, this is, holy shit, now I have to deal with this. And then, well, what do I do? Right? How do I do this? And is this going to be a distraction to what else is going on in our lives? And what I've just found over this very short period of time of, let's call it a listening tour or an understanding tour, is less about how do I go do something that is completely different and outside the realm, and how do I align this to what I'm already doing in life, right? You and I aren't going to go create another podcast, another brand that's related exclusively to racism.
Right.
I don't think you're going to go write a book in the next 8 weeks on your view on this topic. What we can do is use the platforms that we already have to elevate. And that feels really good to me. That feels like constructive, something that I can think about and do right now in these different areas. I was having a conversation with John O'Connor, who many people have heard of. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know he's been both Dominic's coach and is currently my coach. And he talked about how he felt really aligned to police reform because he works with a lot of police officers in his jiu-jitsu class, and how he is now a contributing member to that reform. How do we do that? So like, that isn't something like necessarily new that he's doing, but it's with a new awareness that he's doing it.
That's right, man. And Bryan, I want to put a bow on what you were just talking about, how alignment is so important, to not look at what's happening right now as something entirely separate that has to be added as another thing, but actually is directly in line with what we're talking about. One of our deepest principles that we hold here at The Great Man Within is a great man creates environments where he and those he cares about can thrive. And there's no way that we can say that we are great men if there's an environment where entire races of people are marginalized by society, that are running around with 5x gravity, with 100-pound weighted vests on their shoulders, right? Without the knapsack that we've been given, as we talked about with Peggy McIntosh and white privilege. So this is directly in alignment. It is directly in alignment. It brings an absolutely new category in that is, as Robin DiAngelo says it in White Fragility, it is inconvenient and uncomfortable. So it will require energy. It will require attention in ways that you have never thought before, because these are things that will be emotionally challenging, mentally challenging. I know over this last week, like I've gone down the rabbit hole with all of this stuff. And even though physically I'm still getting the amount of sleep that I normally do, I feel tired because a lot of this stuff, it's emotionally draining, energetically draining. And I am the stereotype, the prototype of white privilege, right? White heterosexual man who grew up in an upper middle class society. I can only imagine how exhausting it must be for Black people right now, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just wanting to put a bow on how this is aligned. Please, if you're looking at this separately, see the ways that it can align to what's the most important things in your life. Now, the final place that we're going to go in this conversation about it is, all right, well, Dominic and Bryan, like, where are you taking this in the next week? Like, what work are you doing? Give me some tangible, practical ways that I can bring this into my life. So, buddy, why don't you start and talking about like what you're doing right now, what you plan on doing for the next week?
So a book that has come recommended to me like 5 or 6 times now is White Fragility. And I'm about maybe halfway through that right now. And what I've noticed, Dominic, is these topics are not new topics, right? White Fragility was written, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, however long ago it was. But my curiosity and interest is piqued. If I would have picked up White Fragility 2 weeks ago, it would have been with like, okay, there's maybe something in here for me, but like I don't have a ton of interest in this. I feel a craving to consume that type of information to open and broaden my perspective that I haven't felt before. So that's number one. I'm listening to White Fragility. Number two is I'm a co-founder of a company called Build Rise. We do HR type consulting. We've had webinars related to the pandemic over the last month. On Monday, Aaron Hinkle, my partner in this, we are both white. We are using that platform for us to learn and to bring in experts in this area. We have something on Monday called Moving from Allyship to Accomplice, which I thought was like, oh my gosh, this is so triggering. And I asked Aaron, I said, well, why are we titling it this? And she sent me all these articles about what it means to be an accomplice in something that needs change. I said, wow, that's really cool. I got a lot more to learn.
Nice.
So I've got a lot more to learn. Those are just a couple of practical things that I'm doing, but mostly, Dominic, I'm giving myself permission. Like permission to learn and to look at this, and permission to continually change my mind. Like change my mind on this is how I used to feel. And I feel some shame about that. And what can I do now? So call it a listening tour. Like, that's what I'm doing.
I love it, man. I love that you're engaged with this. I love that we're having conversations about it. And I love that you're allowing yourself to feel some of the shit. Like I could have done better for so much, like so much earlier, but I'm here now and now I'm committed. Like that sounds great. It feels great.
And what I'm feeling, man, is like, along with that feeling of wanting to understand and consume this information, it feels like this is not a blip on the radar. This is not something that like is really hot right now. And then as soon as this topic goes away, then like, okay, like now we're back to normal. It doesn't feel like we talk a lot about the next normal during coronavirus. Like what's the next normal? What's the new thing? Like this is going to be part of my conversation for the rest of my life. And that doesn't feel heavy. That used to feel really heavy if I was to proclaim something like that. This feels necessary.
That's right.
This feels like the generation where this shit changes.
Wow. I love that. And I would hope that we are a part of that. When I say hope, I mean, I'm certain that I will be a part of doing my part. And whether or not we get to see the fruits of that labor in our time, like that's what I hope for. Not just for myself, but obviously for the people who are most affected. What am I planning on doing over the near term? So there's quite a few things. I'm going to continue to read and write about this and share on podcasts where appropriate. I plan on continuing to give space on my social media accounts to the issues of our times and amplifying Black voices, like Talea suggested, right? Like get other Black leaders in front of your audiences so they can hear and help to translate that message. I plan on doing that. And, I posted something this morning. There's a question that I'm deeply curious about, which is, I wonder why looters, rioters, athletes who kneel spark more outrage than do Black people losing their lives without justice. Right? And we've seen that like over and over again, where Colin Kaepernick is crucified, can't even get a job in the NFL anymore. We see Michael Vick, who ran those dog. What were those things? He did the
dog fighting rings.
Dog fighting rings like years ago, and he was imprisoned for years. There was a national outcry. He was a villain number one for that period of time. And then even fewer things like like lesser things like rioting and breaking store windows. These are getting people up in arms. And then when it comes to, someone getting their neck kneeled on and having their life choked out of them, it just doesn't seem to hit the radar. And as I've been asking the question, why? How is that possible? Right. And I've seen some people in my life who I consider to be good people I've known for my life, who are the quickest to throw in the text message chain, here's another person looting and rioting and breaking a store, or like, I can't believe this guy is kneeling. It's against patriotism, but won't say a thing about Breonna Taylor, doesn't know her name. Won't say a thing about Ahmaud Arbery, doesn't know his name. And it makes me wonder why. And as I've dug deep into it, the painful truth is, there's certain people who can feel the perceived threat to patriotism when Colin Kaepernick kneels. They can feel the perceived threat to their property when someone's looting or rioting, even if they don't live anywhere near where this stuff is happening. Like, there are people out in the country who are nowhere near. I'm living in it. There was a store right below my building that was broken into, Flight Club, just on Sunday night. And 7 of the guys who tried to get out ended up in my courtyard. Our doorman called the police, 911, and got these guys arrested. Like, it's here, literally here in my backyard. And there are people who pay more attention to that, even when it's nowhere near them, than someone getting their life choked out of them, because they can feel that more they can feel someone else's life choked out. If a dog's neck was choked on national television by a police officer, that police officer would be like hung from the streets, right? I don't know why, but I plan on using the Daryl Davis approach. Right? Daryl Davis, who we interviewed last year, I believe in March or April, 3-part episode series of the black man who's gotten 200 KKK members to give up their robes and their hoods. And he always brings a deep-rooted curiosity, right? He's the one who says, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And because Daryl knows at the deepest essence, like, he holds on to a truth that is like irrefutable. Like, and he holds on to this truth of love that he knows if he sits across the table from someone who hates him and just maintains a state of curiosity, how did you get to this place of hatred if you don't even know me? That if he sits there long enough and is persistent enough, that he will eventually be able to lead someone all the way down to the bottom, which is the ultimate truth, which is we're not that different. We're all the same. Like, love is the one that persists. So I actually plan on going out, and I posted this on social media this morning. I said, if you are someone who can feel rioting and looting, who can feel kneeling more than you can feel the loss of a black human without justice, I just want to hear from you. I want to know why. And I'm not even going to try and change your opinion. I just want to know. And that goes for you, our listeners. If there's someone listening right now, reach out to me at doinnerwork.com. Send me an email at dominicq.com as to why you feel that over the other, because I just need to know. And that's what I plan on doing for my focus for the indefinite future.
Hey, Dom, just one more thing. I want to say that I'm sorry. I'm sorry it's taken me this long. Things had to get this drastic for me to wake up to what's going on when it comes to racism and my role in it. I'm sorry to the people in my life that I've affected directly, like my friends who are people of color, people that I've affected indirectly, with not being the ally, not being the accomplice that they needed up to this point in time. And I commit to being that person going forward. And I don't expect there to be trust or even forgiveness given in this moment. And I understand that's something that has to be earned over time. So I'm sorry. And I'm excited to be on this journey with you.